The room was swallowed by a heavy, velvet darkness, illuminated only by the dying embers in the hearth which cast long, flickering shadows against the oak-paneled walls. I could feel Dominic's breath, warm and ragged, ghosting over the sensitive skin of my neck, a sharp contrast to the freezing blizzard howling against the cabin's glass exterior. His hands, large and weathered by years of a life I had only just begun to understand, were locked firmly around my waist, his knuckles white with the effort of maintaining a control that was visibly disintegrating. Every muscle in his body was corded with tension, a silent war raging between the man who had spent 20 years as a pillar of discipline and the man who was currently drowning in the scent of my perfume. I leaned back into him, feeling the frantic thrum of his heart against my spine, a rhythm that matched my own pulse. My fingers reached up, tangling in the thick, silver-streaked hair at the base of his skull, pulling his head down until his lips were a mere fraction of an inch from mine. The air between us was electric, thick with the scent of cedarwood, expensive bourbon, and a raw, primal hunger that defied every social boundary we had sworn to uphold. In that suspended moment, the 25 years between us vanished, leaving only the agonizing gravity of a desire that had been suppressed for far too long, reaching its breaking point. When skin touched skin, this is how the whisper of the forbidden echoed. Before we move on to the rest of the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications to be informed about upcoming videos, and write in the comments where you are watching us from. Tonight's story was submitted anonymously by a listener from Zurich, Switzerland. Have you ever felt the weight of a gaze that shouldn't be lingering on you? Have you ever walked into a room and known, with a certainty that makes your blood run hot, that you are the only person being truly seen, even if the person looking at you is the one person who shouldn't be? It's a strange, intoxicating sensation, like walking along the edge of a cliff where the wind is trying to pull you over, but you find yourself leaning into the breeze anyway. We're taught from a young age that there are lines we shouldn't cross, boundaries meant to protect us from the things we think we want but shouldn't have. But what happens when those boundaries start to feel like a cage? What happens when the logic of the world, the rules about age, status, and propriety, begins to pale in comparison to the sheer, magnetic pull of another human being? I never considered myself a rebel. I was the girl who followed the rules, the one who stayed late at the office to ensure every decimal point was in its place, the one who respected the hierarchy of the architectural firm where I landed my dream internship. I viewed the world in terms of structure and foundation, much like the buildings we designed. But then there was Dominic Sterling. He wasn't just my boss. He was a titan in the industry, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in the halls of design schools. He was also 25 years my senior, a man who possessed a gravity that seemed to bend the very light in the room toward him. From the moment I was assigned to assist him on the Alpine retreat project, I felt that pull. It wasn't something I could explain with a blueprint or a mathematical formula. It was a visceral, quiet hum in my chest that started the first time he looked over my shoulder at a sketch, and I felt the heat radiating from his body. The age gap wasn't just a number. It was a vast, silent ocean between us. He had a lifetime of experiences, a marriage that had ended in a dignified silence years ago, and a reputation for being untouchable, almost monastic in his devotion to his work. I was just starting, full of a nervous energy that I tried to mask with professional tailoring and a quiet demeanor. But the more time we spent together, huddled over drafting tables until the city lights below us blurred into a sea of gold, the more I realized that the ocean between us was narrowing. It wasn't through words. We were always strictly professional, but through the things left unsaid. It was the way he would pause before entering my personal space, the way his voice would drop an octave when he gave me instructions, and the way I would find excuses to be near him, to breathe in the scent of his cologne, which smelled like old books and expensive tobacco. We were playing a dangerous game of shadows, each of us pretending the other wasn't the center of our universe, while the tension between us grew into something heavy and undeniable, a storm waiting for the right moment to break. The baseline of our relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared obsession with the Alpine project. Dominic was a man of few words, preferring to let his designs speak for him. He was rigorous, demanding perfection not just from himself, but from everyone around him. I admired that. I thrived under his scrutiny, pushing myself to anticipate his needs before he even voiced them. I became the person who knew exactly how he liked his coffee black at precisely 10 a.m. and which fountain pen he preferred for sketching on vellum. I learned the rhythm of his moods, the way he would rub his temples when a design wasn't coming together, and the rare, fleeting smile that would touch his lips when I suggested a solution that actually impressed him. For months, this was our world. A world of glass, steel, and late-night deadlines. The office was our sanctuary, a place where the rules of the outside world didn't seem to apply in the same way. In the quiet of the evening, when the rest of the staff had gone home and the only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and the scratching of pens, the air between us would change. It would become dense, charged with an unspoken energy. I would catch him watching me when he thought I was focused on my monitor, his gaze lingering on the curve of my neck or the way I bit my lip in concentration. And I would do the same, memorizing the fine lines around his eyes, the strength in his hands, and the way his tailored shirt stretched across his shoulders. We were like two celestial bodies caught in each other's orbit, spinning closer and closer, yet bound by the laws of physics, or in our case, the laws of professional conduct. He was the ultimate mentor, and I was the eager student, but there was a subtext to every interaction that grew increasingly difficult to ignore. He was always careful, always the gentleman, maintaining a distance that felt both protective and agonizing. He never touched me, not even a hand on the shoulder or a brush of fingers when passing a document. It was as if he knew that the slightest physical contact would be the spark that set the whole structure ablaze. And I, in my youthful curiosity and growing obsession, found myself wanting that spark more than anything. I started dressing with more intention, choosing silk blouses that draped just so and perfumes that were subtle yet lingering. I wanted to be a distraction to him, a crack in his perfect, disciplined facade. I wanted to see if the man who designed such powerful, immovable structures could be moved by me. The shift began subtly, as these things often do. It wasn't a single event, but a series of small, incremental changes in the way we occupied the same space. The professional distance that Dominic had so carefully maintained started to fray at the edges. It began with the eyes. Those brief, accidental moments when our gazes would lock and neither of us would look away quite fast enough. There was a new depth in his eyes, a look of longing that he couldn't quite mask, a look that said he was seeing me not just as an assistant, but as a woman. And I made sure he saw me. I stopped looking away first. I let my gaze linger on his mouth while he spoke, watching the way his lips moved, imagining the feel of them against mine. Then there were the lingering pauses. A conversation about a floor plan would end, but neither of us would move. We would stand there in the silence, the air vibrating with the things we weren't saying. I could feel his awareness of me like a physical heat. If I moved an inch closer, I could almost feel the static electricity jumping between us. He started staying even later, and I, of course, stayed with him. We were no longer just working. We were existing in a shared bubble of anticipation. The office felt smaller, more intimate. Every time he walked past my desk, I could feel the change in air pressure, the scent of him trailing in his wake, making my heart skip a beat. I began to notice the way his body language betrayed him. When he stood near me, he would often find a reason to lean against the desk, his arm just inches from mine. I could see the pulse jumping in his neck, the slight tremor in his hands when he handed me a set of keys or a file. He was fighting it. I could see the struggle in the set of his jaw and the way he would abruptly turn away and walk to the window to stare out at the city. He was a man who valued control above all else, and I was becoming the one thing he couldn't control. It was a heady, powerful feeling to realize that I had this effect on a man like him. I wasn't just an intern anymore. I was a temptation, a living, breathing challenge to his 20 years of discipline. And I leaned into it, my movements becoming slower, more deliberate, my voice softening into a low, intimate register that was for his ears only. The tension reached a new peak during the final week before our presentation to the board. We were exhausted, fueled by caffeine and the sheer adrenaline of the project. One night, around 2 a.m., we were both hunched over the main model of the Alpine retreat. The room was dim, the only light coming from the small LEDs we had installed inside the model to simulate the interior lighting. Our heads were close together as we adjusted the placement of a miniature glass wall. I could feel the warmth of his shoulder against mine, a contact so slight it was almost imaginary, yet it felt like a bolt of lightning. Dominic froze. I could see his profile in the soft glow of the model, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyelashes cast long shadows on his cheeks. He didn't pull away. For a long, breathless minute, we just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, the silence of the office pressing in on us. I could hear his breathing, heavy and rhythmic, and I knew he could hear the frantic pounding of my heart. It was the first time we had truly acknowledged the physical proximity, the first time the barrier had been breached, however slightly. I turned my head to look at him, my face only inches from his. His eyes were dark, swirling with a mixture of desire and a deep, haunting conflict. "Seraphina," he whispered, my name sounding like a prayer and a warning all at once. His voice was thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. He looked down at my lips, then back up to my eyes, his hand hovering near the model as if he wanted to reach out and touch my face, but was terrified of what would happen if he did. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I wanted him to bridge that final inch. I wanted him to be the one to break the rules. But after a moment that felt like an eternity, he stood up straight, clearing his throat and stepping back into the shadows. "It's late," he said, his voice regaining its professional edge, though it was still rough around the edges. "We should go. I'll see you tomorrow." But the way he looked at me before he walked out of the room told me that tomorrow would never be the same. The boundary had been tested, and while it hadn't broken yet, we both knew it was only a matter of time before the weight of our shared desire brought the whole thing crashing down. The opportunity, or the inevitable, came when we had to travel to the actual site of the Alpine retreat for a final inspection before the winter snows made the roads impassable. The site was a remote, rugged stretch of mountainside, hours away from the nearest town. It was a place of stark, breathtaking beauty, where the air was thin and crisp, and the silence was absolute. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the jagged peaks, casting the valley in shades of purple and deep blue. The cabin we were staying in was a modern marvel of wood and glass, designed by Dominic himself, a precursor to the larger project we were building. It was isolated, a sanctuary of luxury in the middle of a wilderness. As we unloaded the car, the first flakes of snow began to fall. At first, they were light and airy, dancing in the wind, but by the time we had moved our gear inside, the sky had turned a heavy, bruised gray, and the wind had begun to pick up. Dominic stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the weather with a frown. "This wasn't in the forecast," he muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "A storm of this intensity this early in the season. We might be stuck here for a day or two." He turned to look at me, and in the fading light, I saw a flash of something in his eyes, not fear, but a sudden, sharp realization. We were alone. Truly alone. No office, no coworkers, no city lights to distract us. Just the two of us, trapped by the elements in a house designed for intimacy. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The professional veneer we had maintained in the city felt thin and fragile here. Every sound seemed amplified, the crackle of the wood in the fireplace, the whistle of the wind through the eaves, the sound of our own footsteps on the polished concrete floors. We fell into a domestic rhythm that felt both natural and dangerously familiar. He started a fire while I unpacked the groceries we had brought. We moved around each other in the small kitchen, our bodies brushing against each other more frequently now, the space too confined for the distance he usually insisted upon. The tension was no longer a hum, it was a roar, a physical presence in the room that made it hard to breathe. The storm outside was intensifying, the snow piling up against the glass, sealing us in our own private world. The world where he was the mentor and I was the student was fading, replaced by a world where we were simply a man and a woman, separated by 20 years and a lifetime of secrets, but bound by a heat that the mountain air couldn't touch. Dinner was a quiet affair, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the hearth and a few candles scattered on the long wooden table. We sat across from each other, the space between us filled with the weight of everything we had been avoiding. Dominic had opened a bottle of wine, a deep, earthy red that seemed to loosen the tight knot of his composure. He talked about his early days as an architect, the struggles he had faced, the sacrifices he had made. He spoke with a vulnerability I had never seen before, his voice low and melodic in the quiet room. I listened, captivated, seeing the man behind the legend, the man who had built a fortress around his heart just as he built fortresses of stone and steel. "I've spent my whole life trying to build things that last," he said, staring into his wine glass. "Things that are permanent, things that follow the rules of geometry and logic. But the older I get, the more I realize that the most important things, they don't follow any rules at all." He looked up at me then, his gaze intense and searching. "You make me question everything I thought I knew about balance, Seraphina." The way he said my name, with such a raw, aching honesty, made my breath catch in my throat. I felt a surge of boldness, a need to push him further, to see if he would finally let go of the edge. "Maybe balance isn't about staying in the center," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Maybe it's about knowing when to lean into the weight." I reached across the table, my fingers grazing the back of his hand. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, catching my fingers in his grip firm and warm. The touch was electric, a physical manifestation of the months of longing. We sat like that for a long time, our hands joined across the table, the only sound the howling wind and the crackling fire. The age gap, the professional boundaries, the expectations of the world, they all felt 1,000 miles away. In this small, candlelit space, there was only the heat of his palm against mine and the unspoken promise of what was to come. He was looking at me with such a profound sense of wonder and terror, as if he was seeing his entire life's work being challenged by the simple act of holding my hand. And I knew in that moment that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing inside the cabin. The power went out an hour later. The subtle hum of the heating system died, and the few lights we had on flickered and vanished, plunging the cabin into a deep, velvety darkness. The only light left was the orange glow of the dying fire. The sudden silence was jarring, making the isolation of the cabin feel even more profound. I could feel the temperature in the room begin to drop, the cold from the blizzard outside seeping through the glass. Dominic stood up, his silhouette tall and imposing against the firelight. "I'll get some more wood for the fire," he said, his voice slightly strained. "And I think there are some wool blankets in the hallway closet. We're going to need them." I watched him move through the shadows, his movements sure and graceful even in the dark. When he returned with the wood and the blankets, he found me sitting on the rug in front of the hearth, trying to coax the embers back to life. He knelt beside me, his presence large and comforting. He added several logs to the fire, the flames roaring back to life and casting a warm, flickering light over us. He then unfolded a thick, heavy wool blanket and draped it over my shoulders, his hands lingering on my arms for a moment longer than necessary. The touch was a jolt to my system, sending a wave of heat through me that had nothing to do with the fire. "You're shivering," he said softly, his face close to mine. I could see the concern in his eyes, but also that same, burning hunger that had been growing all evening. He didn't move away. Instead, he sat down beside me, pulling the other half of the blanket over his own shoulders. We were huddled together, our sides pressed against each other, the warmth of his body radiating through his sweater. I leaned my head against his shoulder, a tentative movement that he met by wrapping an arm around me, pulling me closer. The physical contact was overwhelming. I could feel the strength in his arm, the steady beat of his heart, and the scent of him, wood smoke and wine filling my senses. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames dance, the world outside forgotten. The darkness and the cold had stripped away the last of our defenses, leaving us with nothing but the raw reality of each other. The age gap, which had once seemed like an insurmountable wall, now felt like nothing more than a detail, a minor note in a much larger, more complex symphony of desire. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was heavy, pregnant with the weight of everything we were both feeling. Dominic's hand, which was resting on my arm, began to move in a slow, rhythmic motion, his thumb tracing small circles against my skin. The sensation was agonizingly sweet, a gentle exploration that made my skin tingle and my breath hitch. I could feel the tension in his body, the way he was holding himself back, even now. He was a man who had spent his life practicing restraint, but here, in the dark, with the storm raging outside, that restraint was being pushed to its absolute limit. "I shouldn't be doing this," he whispered, his voice so low it was almost lost to the wind. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring into the fire, his expression pained. "I'm your mentor, Seraphina. I'm old enough to know better. I've spent 20 years building a life based on discipline and integrity, and in one night, you've made me want to throw it all away." He finally turned to look at me, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes broke my heart. "You have no idea the power you have over me. It's terrifying." I reached up, my hand trembling as I cupped his jaw, feeling the slight roughness of his evening stubble. "It's not power, Dominic," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "It's just this thing between us that doesn't care about rules or years. I've wanted you from the moment I met you. Not because of who you are or what you've built, but because of the way you see the world. And the way you see me." I leaned in closer until our foreheads were touching, our breaths mingling in the cool air. "Don't let the rules stop you from being happy. Not tonight." I could feel him shudder, a deep, internal tremor that seemed to shake his very foundation. He closed his eyes, leaning into my touch, a man finally surrendering to a force greater than himself. The air between us was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the electric charge of a long-awaited collision. The distance between our lips was a mere heartbeat, a final, fragile barrier that was about to be obliterated. The first time his lips touched mine, it wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry meeting that had been months in the making. It was the taste of wine and longing, a burst of heat that made the rest of the world vanish. His hands came up to frame my face, his fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer as if he couldn't get enough of the sensation. I groaned into his mouth, my hands finding their way to his chest, feeling the frantic, powerful thrum of his heart beneath the wool of his sweater. The kiss was deep and possessive, a claim being made in the dark, a silent acknowledgement that there was no going back. He pulled me onto his lap, his arms wrapping around me with a strength that was both terrifying and intoxicating. I felt small in his embrace, yet empowered by the way he was trembling against me. He began to trail kisses down my jawline to the sensitive skin of my neck, his breath hot and ragged. Every touch was a revelation, a sensory explosion that made my head spin. I could feel the rough texture of his hands against the silk of my blouse, the contrast of his maturity and my youth creating a friction that was almost unbearable. He was no longer the disciplined architect. He was a man driven by a raw, primal need, and I was the only thing that could satisfy it. We were a tangle of limbs and wool blankets on the rug, the firelight casting our shadows in a frantic dance against the walls. The age gap, the professional boundaries, the logic of the world, it all burned away in the heat of our shared desire. There was only the sound of our breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the overwhelming physical reality of each other. He whispered my name over and over, a mantra of need and surrender, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through my entire body. I felt a sense of profound rightness, a feeling that this was where I was always meant to be, in the arms of a man who understood the architecture of my soul as well as he understood the buildings he designed. The storm outside could rage all it wanted. Inside, we had found a center of gravity that was unshakable, a heat that would carry us through the long, frozen night. The peak of our passion was a slow-motion blur of sensory details. I remember the weight of his body pressing me into the soft rug, the feeling of being completely enveloped by him. I remember the way the firelight played across the silver in his hair and the deep lines of focus on his face. He moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, as if he wanted to memorize every inch of me, every reaction, every sigh. His touch was both reverent and demanding, a masterclass in a different kind of design, the design of pleasure and intimacy. I felt myself opening up to him in ways I never thought possible, my body responding to his with a frantic, instinctive rhythm. Every time our eyes met, I saw the same mixture of awe and desperation. It was as if we were both surprised by the intensity of what we were feeling, by the way the years between us seemed to enhance rather than detract from the connection. His maturity brought a depth to his touch, a knowingness that was incredibly seductive, while my youth brought a fire and an energy that seemed to revitalize him. We were two halves of a whole, finding a balance in the middle of a storm. The air in the cabin was thick and heavy, the scent of our shared heat mingling with the lingering smell of wood smoke. I felt a sense of total surrender, a willingness to let him lead me wherever he wanted to go, trusting in the strength of the hands that had built so much. As the fire began to fade into glowing coals, our movements slowed, the frantic energy of our first collision settling into a deep, soul-stirring intimacy. We were no longer just a man and a woman in a cabin. We were a testament to the fact that desire doesn't follow a timeline. We were breaking every rule we had ever lived by, and yet it felt like the most honest thing either of us had ever done. The peak was not just physical, it was an emotional and spiritual convergence, a moment of pure, unadulterated connection that defied explanation. In the quiet aftermath, as we lay tangled together under the blankets, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic breathing of two people who had finally found what they were looking for in the most unexpected of places. The afterglow was a soft, heavy-breathing silence that settled over us like a second blanket. We lay there for a long time, limbs entwined, the heat of our bodies the only thing keeping the encroaching cold at bay. The fire had settled into a steady, pulsing glow of orange embers, casting a dim, romantic light over the room. Dominic's head was resting on my chest, his breath slow and even against my skin. I ran my fingers through his hair, the silver strands catching the faint light, feeling a sense of peace that I had never known before. The storm was still raging outside, the wind rattling the glass, but inside, the air was still and sweet. I never thought. He began, his voice a low, sleepy murmur. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. I knew what he meant. He never thought he would feel this way again, or perhaps he never thought he would feel this way at all. He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look at me, his eyes soft and filled with a lingering wonder. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my lower lip, his touch incredibly gentle. "You're extraordinary, Seraphina. You've brought light into a very dark, very disciplined corner of my life." I smiled, pulling him down for a soft, lingering kiss. "We're both extraordinary, Dominic." Together. We spent the rest of the night in that quiet, intimate space, talking in whispers about things we had never shared with anyone else. The age gap didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a bridge, a way for us to bring different perspectives and experiences to our connection. He told me about his fears of aging, of becoming obsolete, and I told him about my fears of not being seen, of being just another face in the crowd. In the darkness of the mountain cabin, we saw each other clearly for the first time. The fulfilled desire had opened a door to a deeper level of intimacy, one that promised a future that was as complex and beautiful as the buildings he designed. The blizzard outside was a wall between us and the rest of the world, a temporary sanctuary where we could be ourselves without the weight of expectations. The morning brought a world of blinding white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, pristine blanket of snow that muffled all sound and transformed the landscape into a crystalline wonderland. The power was still out, but the sun was streaming through the windows, reflecting off the snow and filling the cabin with a bright, cold light. We woke up slowly, the transition from the intimate darkness of the night to the stark reality of the morning feeling both beautiful and a little bit daunting. The physical separation was inevitable, but the memory of our night together was a tangible presence in the room. Dominic was already up when I opened my eyes, standing by the window with a cup of coffee he had somehow managed to make on the gas stove. He was dressed in his thick wool sweater and trousers, the disciplined architect once again, but there was a softness in his eyes when he turned to look at me that wasn't there before. "The roads are blocked," he said, his voice warm and steady. "It'll be a few hours before the plows get up here. We have some time." He walked over to the bed, or the rug where we had ended up, and sat down beside me, handing me a second cup of coffee. The touch of our fingers as I took the cup was a reminder of everything that had happened. The lingering memory of his touch, the way he had looked at me in the firelight, the sound of his voice whispering my name, it was all still there, beneath the surface. We spent the morning in a quiet, domestic bliss, clearing snow from the porch and making a simple breakfast. There was a new ease between us, a shared secret that made every look and every touch more meaningful. We didn't talk about what would happen when we returned to the city, to the office, to the world of rules and boundaries. We didn't have to. The memory of the storm and the heat we had found in the middle of it was something that could never be taken away. It was a foundation, a structure built on a night of forbidden desire, and we both knew it was strong enough to withstand whatever came next. As the sound of the snowplow echoed in the distance, signaling the end of our isolation, we stood together on the porch, looking out at the vast, white valley. The world was waiting for us, with all its questions and its judgments, but for a final moment, we were still alone in our sanctuary. Dominic turned to me, his expression serious, but filled with a quiet strength. He took my hands in his grip firm and grounding. "This doesn't end here, Seraphina," he said, his voice a low, intimate promise. "The rules might still exist out there, but we've found something that's more important than the rules. We'll find a way." I nodded, leaning into him, feeling the familiar warmth of his body. "I know we will." We made our way back to the car, the transition from the mountain retreat to the city feeling like a journey between two different worlds. But as we drove down the winding mountain roads, the memory of the night, the fire, the wine, the forbidden heat of our collision stayed with me, a secret fire that I would carry back into the world of glass and steel. We had crossed a boundary, and in doing so, we had discovered a truth that was more powerful than any blueprint or architectural design. Every story has a beginning, and while ours was born in the shadows and the storm, it was a beginning that promised a lifetime of exploration. The age gap was no longer a vast ocean. It was a depth of field, a way of seeing the world with more clarity and more passion. And so, I invite you, dear listener, to think about the boundaries in your own life. Are they there to protect you, or are they keeping you from the very thing you need? If you have a story of a forbidden attraction, of a moment when the rules simply didn't matter, we want to hear it. Send your secret stories to our channel, and let us share the whispers of your own forbidden echoes. Don't forget to subscribe and join our community of listeners who know that the best stories are the ones that happen when the lights go out. Until next time, keep the fire burning. #####.